It was a crisp autumn evening in 2018 when the peaceful suburban neighborhood of Los Angeles was shattered. The tranquility of the Harrison family home was broken by the chilling discovery of David Harrison's lifeless body. He was found sprawled in the middle of the living room, his throat slashed, blood soaking into the carpet. Claire Harrison, David's wife, was the one who found him. In a state of panic, she immediately called 911, her voice trembling as she tried to explain what had happened. "I came home and found him like this. I don't know what happened," she cried. But there was something about her calm demeanor that didn't quite add up. As police arrived, they quickly noticed the lack of forced entry. There were no signs of a struggle, suggesting that David knew his attacker. The scene was unsettling, but what made it even more disturbing was the fact that Claire seemed too composed for someone who had just found her husband murdered. She was sobbing, yes, but there was a coldness in her eyes that made Detective Sarah Miller uneasy. Was this really just a break-in gone wrong, or is there more to the story? Detective Miller thought to herself as she observed Claire's every move. Something didn't sit right. The investigation quickly turned its focus to Claire. The authorities began to dig into her past and her relationships. David was a successful businessman, a man with many enemies, but none who seemed to have the motive to kill him. But as the investigation unfolded, the detectives learned more about Claire's history. She had been married before, to a man named Ethan Turner, and though their divorce had been amicable, whispers of infidelity and financial disputes hung over their past. Ethan had moved out of town after the divorce, but he had returned recently, supposedly to visit his daughter. Could Ethan be involved? Or was the answer far closer to home? Detective Miller's team began combing through the financial records of the Harrison family. David had recently made significant changes to his life insurance policy and had transferred substantial assets into Claire's name. Could this be a motive? Did Claire kill her husband for money? Or was there something deeper at play? As the team continued to investigate, the pieces of the puzzle slowly started to fall into place, but what they uncovered only deepened the mystery. The more they dug into Claire's life, the more strange details began to surface. Claire had appeared to be living the perfect life on the outside. She had a beautiful home, a loving husband, and was well respected in the community. But behind closed doors, there were cracks in the facade. Detectives uncovered that, in the days leading up to David's death, Claire had been in frequent contact with Ethan. She was also seen meeting him in secret. Could they have rekindled their old flame? Was there more to their relationship than just old friends? And what about her marriage to David? Was it really as perfect as it seemed? Claire's behavior was becoming harder to explain. While she was cooperative with the authorities, she had moments of nervousness, constantly glancing at her phone, as if expecting a message or a call. She denied any involvement in her husband's death but couldn't provide solid alibis for her whereabouts on the night of the murder. What was she hiding? Meanwhile, David's brother, Luke Harrison, was also under suspicion. Luke had always lived in the shadow of his more successful brother, and their relationship had been strained for years. The tension between them had recently escalated, with David threatening to cut Luke off financially. Was this the motive for Luke to take matters into his own hands? The detectives knew they had to look deeper into their family dynamics. The breakthrough came when Detective Reynolds spoke to the neighbors. Several had reported hearing raised voices from the Harrison house the night of David's death. Though none could identify a second voice, it was clear that David had not been alone before his murder. Was it Claire, Luke, or someone else? The investigation continued with no clear answers, but one thing was certain: the story Claire had given was unraveling. There were too many inconsistencies in her statement, and the pieces weren't fitting together. Detective Miller's instincts told her that this wasn't a simple case. There was more to this story, and she was determined to uncover it. As the detectives moved forward with their investigation, the tension within the Harrison family continued to rise. Luke became more and more agitated, and Claire's anxiety was palpable. Her life was beginning to fall apart, and the weight of her secrets was beginning to crush her. As she walked through the halls of the house where she had once built a life with David, Claire couldn't help but wonder how it had all gone so wrong. It seemed like the perfect life, but appearances could be deceiving. The investigation was far from over, and the truth, whatever it was waiting to be discovered. But who was behind David Harrison's death? And what dark secrets were the family still hiding? At this point, the investigation is intensifying. Detective Miller knows there's more to uncover, and each day brings new challenges. As Claire's emotional walls start to crack, Detective Miller presses her harder. The more Claire denies any involvement, the more the truth seems just out of reach. Claire Harrison's perfect life was about to shatter in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine. As the days passed, the investigation into David Harrison's murder became more tangled. Detective Sarah Miller and her partner, Detective Tom Reynolds, were determined to uncover the truth, but every new lead seemed to only raise more questions. It was clear that there was much more beneath the surface of the Harrison family's seemingly perfect life. The first step in the investigation was to piece together David's last known hours. Detective Reynolds began by interviewing David's assistant at the real estate firm where he worked. She described him as distracted and preoccupied when he left the office that afternoon, an unusual behavior for a man known for his business acumen and meticulous planning. The assistant had mentioned that David seemed unusually anxious and had left earlier than usual. That small detail stuck with Reynolds, suggesting that something had been bothering David in the hours leading up to his death. Meanwhile, Detective Miller focused on Claire. The more she learned about Claire's life, the more suspicious it became. Claire had been married before to Ethan Turner, a charismatic entrepreneur whose business ventures had often ended in failure. They had divorced 5 years ago, supposedly amicably. But the more Miller dug into their past, the more it seemed that the wounds of their marriage were still raw. Whispers of infidelity and financial disputes lingered, even after their divorce. Claire had accused Ethan of cheating, while Ethan had claimed that Claire's extravagant spending habits had nearly ruined him financially. What was more unsettling, however, was Claire's recent behavior. It was revealed that she had been in frequent contact with Ethan in the days leading up to David's death. The detectives found phone records showing several calls between Claire and Ethan. Some of the calls had been made during the evening hours, just days before David's murder. Was there more to their relationship than just a shared past? Had they rekindled their romance, or was there something darker going on? But Claire wasn't the only person with ties to David's past that needed to be explored. Detective Miller turned her attention to Luke Harrison, David's younger brother, who had always lived in David's shadow. The tension between the two men had been palpable for years, and it had only grown worse in recent months. David had been the one to support Luke financially, but now that David was talking about cutting him off, things were more strained than ever. The detectives learned that Luke had been seen arguing with David just days before his death. The argument had reportedly been over money. David had threatened to stop financially supporting Luke, a decision that would leave Luke completely dependent on his own unstable finances. The neighbors who lived next door to the Harrisons had overheard the argument. They reported hearing raised voices, but no one could identify the second voice. The silence between David and Luke had been deafening since that day. Luke had been particularly agitated after the argument, and the detectives couldn't help but wonder if his resentment had driven him to kill his brother. As the investigation deepened, Claire's story began to fall apart. She had claimed to have been shopping at the mall on the day of David's murder, but there were no security camera records to verify her alibi. She had also made several strange decisions. Claire was the last person to see David alive, yet she had waited hours before calling the police, a delay that seemed suspicious to the detectives. What was she hiding? Why had she waited so long to report the death? And then there was Ethan Turner. Despite his apparent absence from the night of the murder, the detectives could sense that he was somehow involved. Ethan had been seen at the Harrison house on several occasions in the weeks leading up to David's death. He had even visited Claire the night before the murder. His alibi for the evening was shaky at best, and while he denied any involvement, the connection between him and Claire raised many red flags. The plot thickened as the detectives uncovered more details about David's personal life. David had recently made significant financial moves, transferring large sums of money into Claire's name, and taking out a large life insurance policy. Was he preparing for the future, or was he anticipating something more dire? What did these actions mean for the investigation? And what role did Claire play in all of this? As the detectives continued to question those closest to David, they began to piece together a web of deceit. Claire's lavish lifestyle had drained the family finances, and David's decision to cut her off had created a dangerous rift. Ethan, who had never truly severed his connection to Claire, had begun visiting her again, fueling rumors of an affair. And Luke, desperate and resentful of his brother, had been driven to his breaking point. Everything seemed to point to Claire, Luke, and Ethan, but the truth was still elusive. The detectives were no closer to finding out who had killed David Harrison, and the closer they got to the truth, the more the family's dark secrets seemed to surface. Detective Miller couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. There was one more thing they hadn't fully explored: David's professional life. Though his business was thriving, he had made a few enemies along the way. He was known for being ruthless in negotiations, and it was possible that someone from his business dealings had played a role in his death. Could it have been a business rival who had orchestrated his murder? Or was it simply a crime of passion within the family? The deeper they dug, the more they realized that everyone had a motive. The evidence was mounting, but the true killer remained a mystery. The investigation had now reached a critical point. The detectives were closer than ever to uncovering the truth, but with every step, new complications arose. The walls around Claire and her family were closing in, and the pressure was mounting. What was the truth behind David's murder? And who among them was hiding the darkest secret? The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but Detective Miller knew that the answer wasn't going to come easy. The truth was hidden beneath layers of lies and deceit, and only one thing was certain: the killer was someone close to David, someone who had known him intimately. And as the detectives drew closer to the truth, they realized that the darkest secrets were still yet to be uncovered. The investigation had reached its tipping point. Detective Sarah Miller felt the pressure mounting as the walls around Claire, Luke, and Ethan slowly closed in. Each piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every confrontation was bringing them closer to the truth. But even with all the clues, the truth still seemed elusive, hiding beneath layers of deceit and tangled emotions. The day had come when the truth could no longer be avoided. Someone had to face the consequences of their actions. Detective Miller and her partner, Detective Tom Reynolds, had spent weeks piecing together the puzzle of David Harrison's death. The suspects were clear: Claire Harrison, his wife, Luke Harrison, his resentful brother, and Ethan Turner, the ex-husband with lingering feelings for Claire. But the question remained: who had actually killed David? The breakthrough came when Detective Miller sat down for another round of questioning with Claire. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. Claire had been avoiding direct answers, constantly shifting her story. But Miller was determined to push her to the breaking point. As the questioning grew more intense, Claire's composure began to crack. "Claire, you've told us several times that you didn't want to hurt David. But your actions tell a different story. You were planning to leave him, weren't you? You were ready to start a new life with Ethan," Detective Miller said, her voice calm but firm. Claire's eyes shifted nervously as she avoided making eye contact. She had been defensive throughout the questioning, but now, the truth was too close to hide. With a shaky breath, Claire finally spoke. I didn't want to kill him. But I was trapped. Trapped in a life I didn't want. Ethan and I, we were going to start over. But I never thought it would go this far. I never thought David would be dead." Her voice faltered as the weight of her confession settled in. Detective Miller felt a surge of realization flood over her. Claire was the key to unraveling the mystery. But there was more to the story. There was someone else involved. Just as Miller was about to continue, a knock on the door interrupted. Detective Reynolds stepped in, his face grim. "We have Luke. He's confessed." The room grew still. Claire's face went pale. What do you mean?" "Luke confessed?" Reynolds nodded solemnly. "He admitted to the murder. It was him. He lost control in the heat of the moment." Claire's hand shook as she clasped it over her mouth. She had always known there was tension between the brothers, but hearing the truth now left her in shock. Luke Harrison, the younger brother who had always been overshadowed by David, had been pushed too far. The jealousy, the financial dependence, and the resentment had all built up to a boiling point. The confession was a gut punch. Luke had finally broken down under the pressure, admitting that on the night of David's murder, he had gone to the house to confront his brother about the money. The argument quickly escalated. Luke, furious and desperate, had grabbed a nearby object, and in a fit of rage, struck David. The blow had been fatal. Luke didn't mean to kill him. It was a rash decision, one that he immediately regretted, but it was too late. The deed was done. I didn't want to kill him. I just wanted him to stop controlling me, to stop making me feel small. But when I hit him, I saw his eyes, and I knew he was gone. Luke's voice trembled as he confessed. Detective Miller stood silent for a moment, processing the gravity of Luke's words. The tragedy wasn't just in the murder itself but in the years of unspoken animosity between the brothers. Luke's confession was the breaking point, the moment everything shattered. The murder wasn't about money, it wasn't about love, it was about control. Luke had wanted to be free from David's shadow, but in his desperate need for autonomy, he had taken a life. Claire listened to the confession, her face a mix of horror and disbelief. She had known about the tension between the brothers, but hearing Luke's admission brought everything into focus. She had no idea that Luke was capable of such violence, but in a way, it made sense. Luke had always been the overlooked brother, the one who lived with resentment. She had been so focused on her own plans with Ethan that she had failed to see the cracks in her own family. And then there was Ethan Turner. Claire had turned to him for comfort, for a way out of her suffocating marriage, but now she saw how deep her entanglement had gone. Ethan had been part of the deception, part of the plan, but he wasn't the one who physically committed the murder. He had been the silent partner, offering Claire the emotional escape she had sought, but when things went wrong, he had remained in the shadows, helping to cover up the truth. As the confession settled in, Detective Miller looked at Claire with a mixture of sympathy and disappointment. "You weren't innocent in this, Claire. You were planning to leave David. You were part of this story. But Luke is the one who took the fatal step." Claire's face crumpled as the reality of the situation hit her. She had wanted to escape. She had wanted to start fresh with Ethan, to leave behind the marriage that no longer made her happy. But now, that dream was shattered. Her life, her marriage, and her future with Ethan had all come to a devastating end. She had been complicit in a web of lies, but she hadn't anticipated that her actions would lead to her husband's death. Luke, the broken brother, had confessed to the murder. But it wasn't just his actions that led to David's death. It was the years of tension, the years of control, the broken relationships, and the desperate choices that ultimately culminated in that one fateful moment. It wasn't just a crime of passion, it was the result of years of family dysfunction and unresolved anger. As the truth came to light, Detective Miller knew the case wasn't over. The legal process would now take its course, but the emotional toll on everyone involved was far from finished. Claire, Luke, and Ethan would all face the consequences of their actions, but the scars of their choices would remain. The story wasn't just about a murder, it was about broken families, lost trust, and the devastating effects of unchecked emotions. In the end, the Harrison family was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered life, each of them carrying the weight of a decision that could never be undone. The tension in the air was suffocating as Detective Sarah Miller and her partner, Detective Tom Reynolds, prepared for the final confrontation. The truth about David Harrison's murder had slowly unfolded over the past few weeks, but it was only now, when all the pieces were finally coming together, that they could confront the full extent of the secrets hidden within the Harrison family. Luke's confession had brought them closer to the truth, but there was still one critical piece of the puzzle left: Claire Harrison. She had been the last person to see David alive, and while Luke's actions had led to the fatal blow, Claire's role in the events that unfolded was undeniable. It was time to bring it all into the light. Miller and Reynolds had called Claire in for a final round of questioning, knowing this would be the moment everything would either collapse or fall into place. Claire walked into the interrogation room, her face pale, her hands shaking as she took her seat. The past weeks had clearly taken their toll on her. She had tried to play the victim, tried to justify her actions, but deep down, Claire knew that the truth was catching up to her. She had been part of this tragedy, whether she wanted to admit it or not. "Claire," Detective Miller began, her voice steady but firm, "we know everything. We know Luke killed David in a fit of rage, but what we don't know is the full extent of your involvement. We know about the affair with Ethan. We know about your plans to leave David. But there's still something you haven't told us." Claire's eyes darted around the room, her breath quickening. The weight of the words was almost too much for her to bear. For weeks, she had hidden behind her guilt, pretending that she was a victim in all of this. But now, as the detectives closed in, the walls were crumbling. "I never wanted David dead," Claire whispered, her voice shaky. I couldn't breathe anymore. Ethan and I were planning to leave together, to start over, but we never meant for it to go this far." Miller's eyes narrowed. "Claire, you're lying to yourself. You may not have intended for David to die, but you knew exactly what you were doing. You were planning to destroy your marriage, you were planning to tear your family apart, and you turned a blind eye to the consequences." Claire's face flushed with a mix of shame and anger. She had tried to justify her actions, but now the truth was undeniable. She had been living in a web of lies, trying to escape her unhappy marriage, but in the process, she had set in motion a chain of events that had led to her husband's death. I didn't think it would end like this," Claire choked out. "I never thought Luke would actually do it. I thought if I just left David, everything would be fine. But I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop him." Detective Reynolds stepped forward, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Claire, you're not fooling anyone. You may not have swung the knife, but you're just as guilty as Luke. You were the one who pushed him to the edge. You knew that if you left David, there would be nothing left for Luke. He would be completely alone, and you used him. You used his resentment to fuel your escape." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes as the harsh truth settled in. She had been so focused on her own escape, her own freedom, that she had failed to see the consequences of her actions. She had left her husband in a vulnerable state, manipulated the people around her, and in the end, it had cost David his life. "I never meant for any of this to happen," Claire sobbed, her voice breaking. "But I did it. I did it for myself. I was suffocating. I didn't know what else to do." Detective Miller, though empathetic, knew the severity of the situation. "This is the final truth, Claire. You didn't just escape from your marriage. You let the chaos unfold, and now we all have to live with the aftermath." The room was heavy with silence as Claire's sobs echoed in the otherwise empty room. She had confessed, but it was a confession that came too late to undo the damage she had caused. Luke's rage had been the trigger, but it was Claire's broken marriage, her affair with Ethan, and her selfishness that had set everything into motion. They were all complicit in this tragedy. As Claire was led away, the weight of her guilt seemed to hang in the air. Detective Reynolds and Miller exchanged a look of solemn understanding. The case was officially closed, but the emotional toll of what had unfolded was far from over. They had cracked the case, but what would happen to Claire and Luke now? Would they ever come to terms with the consequences of their actions? The darkness within the Harrison family had been exposed. What had started as a simple investigation into a murder had turned into a deeper exploration of betrayal, guilt, and the consequences of unchecked emotions. The family had been torn apart, and the price of their lies was steep. As the case wrapped up, the detectives couldn't help but wonder if anyone in the Harrison family would ever truly find peace again. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, spectators, and curious onlookers filled the benches, all waiting to hear the final details of the Harrison family's tragic story. The trial had begun, and Claire, Luke, and Ethan sat in the dock, their fates now in the hands of the jury. What had started as a family drama was now a matter of public spectacle, and everyone involved would face the consequences of their actions. Claire Harrison, dressed in black, her face still a mix of grief and guilt, sat in her seat, staring ahead, barely moving. The weight of her actions hung heavily in the air. She had been the catalyst that had set the tragic events into motion. The prosecutor wasted no time in making the case clear. Claire had betrayed her husband, manipulated her brother-in-law, and used her ex-husband to help cover up the truth. Her affair with Ethan Turner, her plans to leave David, and the manipulation of Luke were all part of a dark plan that had gone terribly wrong. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecutor began, his voice cold and authoritative, this isn't just a case of a murder. It's a case of a broken woman, who, in her desperation to escape a failing marriage, manipulated the people around her. She used her family, she used her husband's brother, and she used Ethan Turner. And in the end, it cost David Harrison his life. Claire's eyes began to fill with tears. She couldn't look at her family anymore. Luke, her brother-in-law, the one who had actually killed David, was sitting a few feet away, his face blank, his arms crossed in defiance. Luke had always felt like the invisible man in the Harrison family, always overshadowed by his successful brother. Now, it was all out in the open. Luke had confessed to the murder, but that didn't stop the defense from attempting to minimize his role. His lawyer argued that it wasn't premeditated, it was an accident, a crime of passion. The death of David Harrison was a tragedy, no doubt, Luke's lawyer spoke, his voice steady, yet laced with tension. But this wasn't murder. Luke Harrison, in a fit of rage, reacted to the years of financial and emotional control that his brother exerted over him. He didn't mean to kill David. He just lost control. This is a case of self-defense, a man pushed to his limits. Luke sat there, his face stone cold, not reacting to the words his lawyer had chosen. His confession had already sealed his fate, but the defense was trying to paint him as a victim of circumstances. However, there was no escaping the harsh truth. Luke had killed his brother, and no matter how hard the defense tried to soften the blow, the evidence was too clear. Meanwhile, Ethan Turner, who had not been physically involved in the murder, sat quietly in his seat, his expression unreadable. The prosecution had painted him as an accomplice, claiming that he had aided Claire in covering up the murder and hiding their affair. Ethan's defense was simple. He had not known Luke was going to kill David, and he had only stepped in to help Claire because of his feelings for her. "I never wanted any of this to happen," Ethan said, his voice shaking, almost pleading as he spoke from the stand. "I was helping Claire because she was in a bad place. I didn't know Luke was capable of this. I was trying to help her, and it spiraled out of control." The defense tried to argue that Ethan had not been involved in the actual murder, but the prosecution was quick to refute. They highlighted his actions in the aftermath of David's death, how Ethan had stayed silent, how he had kept Claire's secret, and how he had helped her cover up the details. All of this pointed to a man who had chosen to protect Claire and ignore the consequences of his actions. As the trial progressed, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. The emotional weight of the case was evident in the faces of those present. Claire, now sitting in the witness stand, finally broke down, her emotions spilling out as she was asked about the night of David's death. Her sobs filled the room as she confessed to everything: the affair, the manipulation, and her involvement in the murder cover-up. "I never wanted David to die," Claire sobbed, her voice cracking under the weight of the truth. "I loved him once. I thought I could leave him, start over with Ethan, but I never thought it would end like this. I never thought Luke would kill him." The courtroom was silent as Claire's sobs echoed through the room. Her face was a mask of regret and disbelief. She hadn't wanted this. But her desperation, her need to escape a life that no longer served her, had led to something far worse than she could have ever imagined. David was dead. And now, Claire had to pay the price. The prosecution made their closing argument, laying out the web of lies and deceit that had been the true cause of David's death. They emphasized that while Luke may have been the one to pull the trigger, Claire and Ethan's actions had set everything in motion. "This wasn't just an accident," the prosecutor said, looking directly at the jury. "This was the result of a series of decisions, selfish decisions, that led to the murder of an innocent man. They all played a part, and they all must be held accountable." Finally, the defense spoke, urging the jury to consider the emotional turmoil that each defendant had endured. Luke, they argued, had been driven to the brink by his brother's oppressive control. Claire had been desperate to escape a loveless marriage. Ethan had only acted out of misguided loyalty to Claire. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours, the weight of their decision heavy on their shoulders. And then, the moment of truth arrived. The judge returned to the courtroom, the air thick with anticipation. The room went completely silent as the verdicts were read. Claire Harrison, guilty of second-degree murder. Luke Harrison, guilty of first-degree murder. Ethan Turner, guilty of accessory after the fact. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Claire's face was pale, her hands trembling as she processed the verdict. She had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. Luke, though, remained stoic, as if he had been expecting this outcome all along. Ethan, on the other hand, looked devastated. His face fell as he realized that his loyalty to Claire had led him down a dark and irreversible path. The weight of justice had been served, but the emotional toll on everyone involved was far from over. Claire would face 20 years in prison, Luke would be sentenced to life without parole, and Ethan would spend the next few years behind bars for his role in the cover-up. But the real punishment was not just in the sentences, it was in the lives that had been destroyed. The Harrison family was shattered. And the echoes of their choices would reverberate long after the trial had ended. The trial had come to an end. The courtroom was quiet as the judge's gavel struck, sealing the fate of Claire, Luke, and Ethan. The verdicts were delivered, but they did nothing to ease the heavy silence that followed. The weight of their actions, the devastation caused by their choices, hung in the air like a thick fog. Claire Harrison, Luke Harrison, and Ethan Turner would now live with the consequences of what they had done, but could they truly pay for the damage they'd caused? Claire sat still, her hands trembling in her lap, staring at the floor. She had always imagined herself escaping her marriage, starting fresh with Ethan, but now she was left to face the reality of her own betrayal. The years of manipulation, the lies, and the affair had led her down a dark path, one that had resulted in David's murder. Her heart ached with guilt as she thought of him, the man she had once loved, now gone because of her desperation to escape a life that no longer felt her own. She had never intended for David to die. She had only wanted out of the marriage, but she had failed to see the chaos that would unfold. Luke's confession had shattered any illusion she had left of innocence. It wasn't just Luke's uncontrollable anger that had killed David, it was a chain of decisions, made one after the other, that had led to this tragic end. She had pushed Luke, knowingly or not, to this breaking point. She had used him in her selfish quest for freedom, and now it was all too clear, her desire for a new life had come at a staggering price. Her mind replayed the moments leading up to David's death, the conversations she had with Ethan, the deceit that had consumed her. The betrayal was not just of David, but of her own family, her own blood. Luke had felt abandoned, unloved, and ignored for so long. His resentment had festered until it reached a point where it became explosive. Claire, in her pursuit of a new beginning, had failed to see that the cracks in her family were too deep to ignore. Her eyes welled with tears as she thought of how much damage she had done, not just to David, but to everyone who had ever been close to her. Her mind, now filled with regret, wondered if it was too late to undo the pain. Could she ever repair the relationships she had shattered? Could she ever make peace with the fact that she had caused someone's death simply because she was unwilling to face her own unhappiness? Luke, on the other hand, sat in his cell, his head bent low, his thoughts consumed by the irreversible act he had committed. The weight of David's death felt like a heavy stone in his chest. His anger had driven him to that moment, the moment when the brother he had always resented and envied lay lifeless on the floor. The family dynamic, so fractured and frail, had pushed him to the breaking point. But the regret? It was overwhelming. Luke's mind swirled with memories of David, the taunts, the insults, the feeling of being less than. He had lived his entire life in David's shadow, a perpetual second best. When David threatened to cut him off financially, Luke had felt the last shred of his dignity crumble. In that moment, Luke had seen no other way out. The rage that had been building for years had overtaken him, and in that moment, he had done the unthinkable. He had killed his brother. The thought of his mother, his friends, and the life they had once shared seemed so distant now. He knew he could never go back to the way things had been. The shame and guilt gnawed at him every moment of the day. Would he ever be able to live with himself? Could he ever forgive himself for what he had done? As for Ethan, the man who had once been Claire's lover, his role in this tragedy had also weighed heavily on his conscience. He had always been the person who came to Claire's rescue, trying to save her from the life she felt trapped in. But now, he too would face the consequences of his actions. His loyalty to Claire had led him to become an accomplice, covering up the murder, allowing her to live with the lie. Ethan had convinced himself that his actions had been out of love for Claire, but the truth was now undeniable: he had made the wrong choices. He had enabled her escape, but in doing so, he had become entangled in a web of deceit. The reality of that was a bitter pill to swallow. As the days passed, the three of them, Claire, Luke, and Ethan, each had to reckon with their choices. They had all played a part in the tragedy, and now they would all pay the price. Claire's future was uncertain. Luke faced a life sentence, and Ethan would spend the next few years behind bars. But no sentence would ever erase the scars left by their actions. The people they had hurt, the ones who had loved David, who had trusted them, would carry the weight of this tragedy forever. The emotional cost of their actions was far greater than any prison sentence. Each of them was left alone with their guilt, their regret, and the knowledge that nothing could undo what had been done. Now, as their lives began to unravel in the harsh light of reality, Claire, Luke, and Ethan were forced to confront the harsh truth: they had broken their family, their relationships, and, ultimately, their own souls. In their attempt to escape from their pasts, they had brought about a future filled with nothing but pain and loss. This story raises a fundamental question: how far are we willing to go to escape our troubles? In Claire's desperation, she failed to see the consequences of her actions. Luke's anger pushed him to the point of no return, and Ethan's misplaced loyalty trapped him in a nightmare he never saw coming. All three were swept away by their emotions, each believing they had a right to change their circumstances without truly understanding the cost. Now, as you've heard their story, we ask, what would you have done in their place? Could they have made different choices, and if so, what would they have been? How do you think they'll live with their decisions? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story has affected you, and we encourage you to share your perspective on the choices the characters made. Would you forgive them? Could you ever find redemption in their shoes? Let's talk about it.